Wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us for exploring the Saugus Iron Works National Historic Site. In the 1600s, on the banks of the Saugus River, something extraordinary happened: the birth of the American iron and steel industry. So we're going to explore the place where European iron makers brought their special skills to a young Massachusetts colony. Saugus Iron Works is a 12-acre National Historic Site that includes working water wheels, forges, mills, a historic 17th century home, and a lush river basin. And we're going to learn about this National Historic Site with the Supervisory Park Ranger, Andrew Donovan. So all 150 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Andrew for joining us this afternoon. And Andrew, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Robert, thank you so much. I was very lucky last week to be here talking about Salem Maritime National Historic Site, another park that I work at. But today, I'm thrilled to join you all for Saugus Iron Works National Historic Site. Like Robert said, my name's Andrew Donovan. I'm the Supervisory Park Ranger for Interpretation at Salem Maritime and Saugus Iron Works National Historic Sites. So I oversee really general public programming, tours, opening historic houses, exploring other sites, and anything that you'd sort of plan on as a general public visitor coming to the park, my team and I work on. So glad to talk to you today about the Saugus Iron Works. I hope I encourage you, especially any locals, to come down and visit the site with us. Now, I do love to point out that we are part of the bigger National Park Service. So national parks, many people, when they think of them, Saugus Iron Works probably isn't the first park you think of, and I understand that. People think National Park Service, they think giant redwood trees, or they think of the Grand Canyon. But the National Park Service protects all sorts of types of federal land. You can see on my slide here, there's national parks, battlefields, monuments, preserves, historical parks, seashores, memorials, and so many more. In total, there's 424 different units of the National Park Service spread all around the country, as well as the US territories. So there's national parks all around the country for you to explore, including some great ones right here in Massachusetts. Now I want to give you just a little visual of our park here at Saugus Iron Works. As Robert said, Saugus Iron Works nowadays is a 12-acre site sitting along the banks of the Saugus River. For anyone of you who's not familiar with the area, Saugus is just an easy drive, as easy as it gets, up Route 1 from Boston to Saugus in Essex County. It is a bit inland. It's on the Saugus River, right at the edge of the river where it turns tidal. And we'll talk a lot about that location during our program today. So when a national park is created, there is lots of discussion leading up to that, and it has to have national significance. What are the stories? What are the resources? Maybe it's cultural or natural that this park is trying to protect. You know, remember the National Park Service, the idea is that these parks are here for enjoyment right now, but they're also going to be taken care of in perpetuity. So my children, my children's children will get to explore and enjoy these parks too. And with that, it needs to have that national significance. It can't be regional, it can't be hyperlocal. It has to have had a bigger impact on the nation as a whole. And the park purpose statement helps speak to that. Why is Saugus Iron Works so important that the National Park Service helps protect and preserve it? And this is our purpose statement for Saugus. So Saugus Iron Works National Historic Site preserves and interprets the reconstructed Hammersmith site, so that's the historic name for this ironworks, and the resources associated with the first sustained integrated ironworks in British colonial America, which operated on the Saugus River approximately 1646 to 1670. Underneath there, we've got two illustrations to help you imagine historically what it would have looked like at this ironworks. Now, even with the park purpose, our stories expand beyond that 1640s to 1670s, right? Indigenous peoples, for example, have lived and worked in this area for tens of thousands of years. And at Saugus Iron Works, there has been extensive archaeological excavations and research done. Mostly that early research was focused on the ironworks site, but during that work, they found thousands of artifacts tied to indigenous peoples that lived here. So as early as 9000 BC, we have evidence in our museum collections of indigenous peoples living right along the Saugus River. Like I said, over 14,000 artifacts are in the collections, and we can even chart with these artifacts the changes in technology from different eras of indigenous life here along the Saugus River. So you can see, for example, those two images pointed two different types of projectile points that were made and found right on site, with the top one going back about 8,000 years, and then the bottom one a bit more recent. One thing that drew indigenous peoples to this area was a stone, actually. It's called Saugus rhyolite, or some people know it as Saugus jasper because of the color of it. And it's a specific type of stone really found in the Saugus area. It makes projectile points. That's actually the bottom photo there is Saugus rhyolite as a projectile point. And there is evidence of this stone, this hyperlocal to Saugus stone, being traded up and down the Atlantic seacoast, into the mid-Atlantic, places like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, or out towards Ohio as well. There's evidence of this type of stone being traded. So these are groups of indigenous people with large trade networks and complex societies that are interacting with other groups all around what we'd call kind of the Eastern United States. Now, at the time of European colonization, it would have been the Pawtucket Native American tribe that would have been living on site in Saugus. And there is evidence of interactions between the indigenous peoples that were still in the area and workers at the ironworks. So as these ironworks got set up in 1640, there were plenty of indigenous people still in the area, some of which were hired to do work for the ironworks. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. Now at the park, you can see lots of this work in our museum. So this is a free museum at the park. It'll be open this summer, starting on June 3rd, Thursdays through Sundays. And it includes artifacts from these excavations, both artifacts like the stone tool at the top there, a stone sort of axe head. And at the bottom, that's actually a hammerhead from the original ironworks. So it spans that time, both looking at indigenous culture, but also looking at the material culture left over from the ironworkers in the 1600s. We do also have an introductory park film on site as well. And a little plug, I know we have people that aren't in the local area. You can also watch that introductory park film on our website too. So if you can't come here in person, you can watch that film for free on the park website. Now, we're shifting gears a little bit towards the establishment of European settlers here, right? So you've got the Massachusetts Bay Colony that's going to be founded 1630 in the area, focused around the Boston area. And this is going to be a society that's built around kind of Puritan religion and laws. So there's going to be these strict laws in place about what you can and cannot do. People can only dress certain ways. Fancier clothes are reserved for high-class people. You can only vote if you are a member of the church and a landowner. So that means that many people can't vote. And I should mention, member of the church, landowner, and male. No women could vote at that time. Even, there was laws against them owning land too. So this young colony is trying to build a bit of a very specific design for it. They're trying to become that city on the hill where they are the perfect religious colony. But they still find themselves reliant on England. They need English goods, especially manufactured goods. You think of things like iron, glass, that are hard to make. And they didn't have the setup to create that here in the colony. So most of it is being brought over from England at great expense and with a reliance on keeping good relationships with suppliers in England. I love the little illustration in the bottom right corner here because it gives us just a little reminder of all the different ways that a colonist might work with iron in their day-to-day life, right? Iron's going to make up the tools they use to cut down trees, to help clear the fields. It's going to make up cooking ware. It's going to make the nails that are going to hold their houses together. It's going to make materials for ships that they'll use for travel, for trade. So iron is a valuable, valuable commodity for this young colony. Now, John Winthrop the Younger, who was actually the son of the governor, is going to take it upon himself and look to establish an ironworks here in Massachusetts. He wants to stop the reliance on Europeans. He wants to be able to produce iron products right here in the young colony. And he is very successful at raising money. He is very charismatic. He goes over to England and he talks with different sympathetic investors over there. He paints this picture of them being able to make good money from this ironworks, right? That the colonies need this iron, so people will be willing to pay, and that they will get a good return on their investment. Now, heading up this project, the younger Winthrop, he decides on a location. And he goes down to the Braintree, Quincy area. They decide to build a blast furnace there, right in Braintree. If any of you are local, you maybe hear the news or like especially the traffic report. The Furnace Brook Parkway is going to get its name from the Furnace Brook, which is the brook that would have powered the furnace down in Braintree, Quincy. Unfortunately, John Winthrop Jr., great at raising money, not really great at planning an ironworks. He really didn't know the process of creating this very complex system that an ironworks needed. So the investors start to get pretty annoyed with him. They're seeing that things are stalling. Their location for the first blast furnace is not working out. So they want somewhere that they can get a full ironworks built, not just a blast furnace, but they want a forge. They want a rolling and slitting mill. They want all these different pieces that can take raw iron ore and turn it into material that can be sold to blacksmiths to make tools. So they decide to go a different route. The English investors turn towards Richard Leader, who was actually a non-Puritan, and he is hired from England and he's sent over to the colony. And it's his job to find a new location for this grand ironworks that they have in their head. This is going to be the start of pulling in specialized skills workers from England. And it's going to lead to a lot of tension throughout this story. Richard Leader, like I said, he's non-Puritan. He's not going to necessarily agree with the laws and customs of these young colony. Now, when he comes over, Richard Leader, he starts looking for a new location, right? It's all about picking the right location. He searches around the area. Now, I said that Saugus today is an easy drive from Boston. Back then, it's going to be kind of the edge of the wilderness, if you will, for the colonists, right? There's not going to be much settlement out there for the early colonists in the 1640s. So this is a bit of not necessarily uncharted territory, but it is not a busy hub of activity during the 1640s. Now, what's he looking for as he's looking for this location? Well, he's looking for a few different pieces. One, they need power. You're going to have lots of heavy machinery that's going to be running most of the time, for some of it, 24 hours a day. They don't want to rely on human power. They don't want to rely on things like ox or horses for the power. What they need is water. Water power from flowing, rushing, dropping water that can turn water wheels to run this heavy machinery. connected with water, you're also going to be bringing in lots and lots of raw materials. You can see some of them there: iron ore, gabbro, which is another type of rock, and charcoal. You're going to be bringing in some of those heavy materials day after day after day. And leaving the ironworks is going to be heavy, heavy bars of iron or cast iron in pots and pans. All of this is going to take a real toll on whatever you're transporting it on. So even nowadays, most of global trade still relies on shipping across the oceans, for example. Back in the 1600s, it was even more so the case. They're going to have very rudimentary roads systems. So anytime that you can use boats to move things up and down the coast or to bring things to your location, that's going to be the most successful. That's going to be the most successful system. So he starts searching for this location, finds it along the banks of the Saugus River. Hopefully you can see my little yellow star here on the map. Hindsight, I might have made that a little bit bigger. But this is going to be the site of the ironworks. Like I said, this is a very special spot on the river. You have the river flowing kind of from the north here, flowing down towards the ocean. So you've got a steady stream of water. And on the flip side, the spot that's chosen is right at the edge of sort of the tidal part of the river. So during high tide especially, you can easily get small boats coming up this river and meeting the ironworks. So this would be boats with raw materials or boats coming from the ironworks and out to the harbor and over to Boston. So creating Hammersmith. So this new ironworks is going to be called Hammersmith historically. Today we refer to the site as Saugus Iron Works National Historic Site, but historically it was known as Hammersmith. It operated from about 1646 to roughly the early 1670s. It's a little unclear, that end date. Records for some of that business work aren't great, especially towards the end of the ironworks kind of time in operation. But it is truly a highly complex system for a new colony. Like I said, these investors, they want to build a blast furnace, they want to build a forge, a rolling and slitting mill, all of which are going to create are going to need lots of effort, lots of raw materials, and lots of workers to keep running. Nowadays, our site's about 12 acres. Historically, Hammersmith would have been much, much larger, because included with this isn't just the ironworking buildings. It's also worker housing for the dozens of workers that are going to be working here day in and day out, and their families for many of them. It's going to be farms to feed the workers, farms to feed the animals that they'll have on site, like the oxen. It's going to be storage areas for all that charcoal, that gabbro, that bog ore that will be delivered. And it's going to include a large reservoir of water to make sure that these ironworking buildings have the power they need, like I said, for some of them, day in and day out. I want to bring up this map one more time just to kind of highlight what is on site nowadays. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the iron making process here. And that's going to be focused down on what we call the industrial site, with the blast furnace, the forge, and the rolling and slitting mill. These three main buildings are going to be the kind of industrial buildings for the ironworks. One thing I like to point out is that these are replica buildings built in the same style, built in the same way, and on the same locations, but these are not original buildings from the 1640s. These are buildings that were rebuilt to illustrate, based on archaeological evidence, what was happening here in the 1600s. There is one 1600s building on site that is actually called the Ironworks House up here on the left. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go. But first, we're going to start about what does it actually look like at the ironworks. in the 1600s. Now, things at the ironworks really start at the blast furnace. So the blast furnace is a stone furnace for melting iron ore. Raw materials, so that's going to be the iron ore, the gabbro, and the charcoal, are going to be fed into the top of the furnace. You can see it in this illustration. You've got two workers feeding this furnace with the those raw materials. And they're going to layer them. So it's going to be a layer of charcoal, a layer of bog iron, and a layer of gabbro. And then they're going to keep repeating it. It's sort of like a big parfait, right? So they're going to have layer after layer after layer to create this iron. You can see that this is going to be pretty intensive, right? So to get 1 ton of iron, you're going to need to put in 3 tons of bog ore, 2 tons of gabbro, and 265 bushels of charcoal. So this is a huge amount of raw materials that's being fed into this blast furnace. Towards the bottom of the image, you might see these 2 large wooden bellows. This is going to keep the heat up to run this furnace. So once the furnace gets lit, they're going to have the bellows pushing in air constantly because the temperature needs to stay at about 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit for this process to work smoothly. This blast furnace is going to start up usually early spring or so. And the whole plan is once that furnace gets going, you want to keep it running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, basically until it can't run anymore. Eventually, the interior of the furnace is going to start to get damaged after the wear and tear. So once you've gotten through that season, for example, of kind of the blast furnace work, then workers will go in and repair the interior of the furnace to get ready for the next year. But when this is in operation, you're going to hear this running 24 hours a day. That water wheel is going to be spinning. The bellows are going to be pumping. You're going to have people constantly dumping those materials in the top and people on the bottom tapping that molten iron to remove it from the furnace. We'll get to that in just a minute. But I keep mentioning these 3 raw materials, right? Bog ore, gabbro, and charcoal. I want to take just a minute to explore what each of those 3 does for the iron making process. So bog ore obviously is going to be vital because that is where your iron is, right? When Richard Leader was setting up this ironworks, he was looking for where iron can be found locally. And interestingly, a lot of iron in the Massachusetts area historically was found in bogs. So as organic materials would settle and everything and mesh with the rocks, you'd get this bog ore formed. So like you can see in that top illustration, you might have workers out there with nets and poles getting it from bogs and swamps. Other times, farmers might find it in a field. If their field had once been a bog, they might be plowing the field and pull up this kind of reddish, rusty looking rock, understandably, right? Rusty looking. Often this is about less than 50% iron. So usually there's other types of impurities that are meshed in with this bog ore, and they have to be removed during the melting process in the furnace. That's where our next raw material comes in, That's going to be gabbro. So this is a local stone. It's used as a flux, which is a way to help purify the ore. So when you put the bog ore and the gabbro into the furnace, the gabbro is actually going to melt first, and it's going to help kind of pull those non-iron pieces from the bog ore and the impurities and kind of condense them and separate them from the iron. If you were in England in the 1600s or other places in the United States, like Hopewell Furnace in Pennsylvania, a lot of times they used limestone for this same flux purpose. Locally, there wasn't a good supply of limestone, but gabbro, which was mined at Nahant, which is actually right at the end of the Saugus River, could easily be brought to the ironworks. And the last piece that you need is that charcoal. Now, charcoal is extremely labor intensive to make. This is going to involve woodcutters, carters to move the wood and then the eventual charcoal, and colliers who are going to be specialized workers that create this charcoal. It's created by kind of slowly and controlled, basically burning the wood in a specific way to create this fuel source. It's going to take between 10 and 14 days for wood in these big mounds, like you see in the background of this picture, to be slowly and carefully converted into charcoal. There is record, like I said, of indigenous peoples being paid for work with this, especially for wood cutting. So like I said, a unique connection and a reminder that these indigenous stories continue well into today, obviously, but there is overlap between the iron workers and some of the indigenous peoples here. Now you bring all three of these raw materials on site, you fill up that furnace, like I said, layer after layer, and it all starts slowly melting down. What happens next is at the bottom of the furnace. And that's going to be in what's called the casting shed. So once or twice a day, the furnace is going to be basically tapped. They're going to pull out the liquid iron and the waste materials from part of the furnace. So when it's tapped, slag, which is kind of the waste material that's formed during the process, that's actually going to float on top of the iron. So you have iron on the bottom, you've got your waste material slag on the top. Sometimes in the slag, you'll also get like bits of charcoal that didn't burn and things like that. Iron workers want to take that iron, they want to put it into long channels in the sand floor. So you can see in this top illustration, you've got an iron worker pulling out some of that liquid iron into this long channel. It's going to create what's called pig iron. So pig iron named after, as it comes out, sometimes they do offshoot channels off that pig iron. So it sometimes would look like a kind of a mother pig feeding her little piglets. This iron is going to cool in the sand, and it's going to be used to make wrought iron. That's going to be a stronger type of iron that'll be used for lots of different tools. But sometimes you want materials made out of cast iron. I'm sure some of you can think of cast iron things you have in your house, like a cast iron skillet, for example, is a great one. They could also do that in this casting shed. So molds were created, they were buried in the sand. That's this illustration on the bottom. And carefully, iron workers would scoop out this molten metal and they'd pour it into these molds. And from that, you would get pots, you'd get kettles, salt pans, firebacks, things with specialized shapes and everything that aren't going to have like a high impact piece. You know, you don't want cast iron for a hammerhead because it's just going to shatter if you try to use it, or a saw blade. But you do want cast iron for things with specialized shapes or unique angles. In the bottom right there, you can actually see an example of a cast iron pot that was found on site in Saugus. Cast ironware like pots and kettles, those are going to be eventually dug out of the sand when they're cooled. They'll be sanded down and prepped a little bit, and then they'll be ready to be sent to Boston, where the storehouse is for the ironworks. So for those cast iron pieces, those are kind of finished products ready to be sold. Most of the iron, though, is going to go to the, I'm getting ahead of myself. With the furnace, you're pulling out that iron, right? That's the bread and butter. That's the whole point of doing this process. But you're also going to get stuck with slag. It's a waste material. It's basically a stone eventually when it cools of all that extra flux, that gabbro and everything that was pulled out of the bog ore. And the ironworkers really didn't have use for it. So what do you do with the stuff that you want to get rid of? Well, you just dump it right next to your work spot. So they would, from the casting shed, they'd roll it on wheelbarrows and just dump it on the side of the river. Over time, they created this kind of long, thin ridge along the banks of the river. You can see it in this picture from 1900, kind of behind the tree on the left. This ridge with the grass grown over is actually what's called the slag pile, that pile of that waste material. Now, I said that this whole area is a reconstruction, right? When archaeologists were trying to figure out the layout of the historic ironworks, they looked at the slag pile and they realized that, well, workers aren't going to bring all this waste material far. They're not going to haul it, a ways away. So they used the slag pile and they worked backwards. They drew a straight line from the slag pile and started exploring and digging in that area. And that's how they actually found the base of the historic blast furnace there. So this was a clue for archaeologists about where this work was actually happening on the Saugus River. Okay, now we're moving to the forge. So much of the work that was going on at the ironworks was to take that pig iron bar from the blast furnace and turn it into wrought iron. So this is going to be a main product that's sold by the ironworks to blacksmiths throughout the colony. So at the forge, pig iron bars are going to be brought in and they're going to be really reworked over and over and over again. So first, they're going to melt them down and they're going to use sledgehammers. They're trying to get excess carbon out of there. They're trying to reshape it. So structurally, really some of like the carbon in there and everything starts to get more lined up and uniform to make it stronger, make the metal less brittle. Eventually, they're going to start moving over to using a 500-pound trip hammer to reshape this iron. So you can see in the bottom right there, the illustration of the man holding with tongs that hot iron that's being hit over and over again by this dropping hammer. Slowly and surely, they're going to take it from kind of a blob that's called a bloom, and they're going to work it from the center out into a long uniform merchant bar. This is a standardized sort of size and shape for wrought iron. And this is what a lot of blacksmiths are going to buy. They would buy these merchant bars, and then they're going to use them to create most of the tools or the specialty products that they're making in blacksmith shops. You can imagine this is intense, hard work for these workers. The noise from the pounding of the hammer over and over again, the heat from 3 fires surrounding you in small hearths has got to be brutal. And you have to take into account most of this work is going to be done, especially in spring and summertime when the weather is going to get the hottest. Now, most of the product that's being made are those merchant bars, right? Blacksmiths want to buy those. But the investors in the ironworks, they decided to get really, pretty daring. And they wanted to get an advanced technology into this ironworks too, called the rolling and slitting mill. So while blacksmiths could take that merchant bar and could then flatten parts of it to, say, make saw blades out of, or they could eventually take pieces out of it to make nails out. The investors wanted to build buildings that could do that work for them. This is pretty new technology in the early 1600s. There are only about a dozen of these rolling and slitting mills in England at the time. And they decided to build one right here in the pretty new colony of Massachusetts Bay. Easiest way I can describe this is like a big pasta machine, right? So you take those merchant bars and you feed them through these moving rollers. So these rollers are spinning in the same direction, and they're pulling in that hot metal. First, they're going to put it through some flatteners to create what's called flats. Those might be long flat bars that can be used to make wagon wheels sturdier, for example, or to be turned into saw blades. Eventually, they're going to take some of those flats, though, they're going to heat them up again, and they're going to feed them through slicers or slitters. That's going to make nail rod, okay? So now we're taking our kind of pieces of lasagna pasta and we're turning it into spaghetti. They're putting that through these tight slitters to create long, thin little bars that are going to be perfect size for creating nails out of. And it's really unique. There's a special artifact that's pictured here in the bottom right that gave these researchers the information needed to help recreate this design. What was the size and shape of these rollers? This is actually basically like a paper jam in the 1600s. This is a piece of merchant bar here that got caught in the slitters. And eventually the workers had to just yank it out, and they're probably sick of it, frustrated, tossed it to the side. It's this sort of mistake piece here, this piece of trash, that helped inform what the design and the layout of this rolling and slitting mill was in the 1640s. Now, throughout all this, we've been talking about all this heavy machinery, right? And it relies on that water power. Bellows, trip hammers, rollers were being run by water wheels. Historically, there would have been at least 7, probably closer to 9 water wheels on site that would have been fed by the holding pond that they got from damming up the Saugus River. Some remnants of these historic water wheels were found during the excavations. A piece of the water wheel in this photo is actually inside the museum if you come to visit. Today, we are proud we have replica water wheels. Nothing special, no hidden pieces about them. They are true wooden water wheels that are run by the power of falling water. So on tours or during special demonstrations, we'll actually run some of these water wheels on site. You can see how they would have powered some of this machinery. And most of this product that's being made is being sold around the colony to blacksmiths. So materials from Hammersmith are going to be sent down the Saugus River, and in Boston is going to be the main warehouse and kind of the selling house. Blacksmiths can buy those big merchant bars. They can buy the flats. They can buy the nail rod and transform them into whatever they see fit. Sometimes families would also buy nail rod. Nail rod became a very easy way for kind of everyone to step up and help make nails for the household. So you might have a night where kids are sitting around the fire and heating up the nail rod and hammering out the tip and making sort of the nail head there. So by having that nail rod, that allowed many people, not just blacksmiths, to have access to creating nails. Now, we touched a bit upon this, but all this work is being done by different ironworkers. And there are 2 main groups that we'll touch on here, one of which are sort of skilled ironworkers recruited from England. These are going to be men and families that are going to be encouraged to come from England and bring their skills and their traditions that they've learned on site in England with them to New England, right? This isn't something you're reading about. This isn't something you're learning easily. This is kind of an apprenticeship role where you learn and you take the lead. So some of the highest paying jobs in the ironworks are going to be, basically the foreman that oversees the blast furnace or that oversees the forge. This is going to come with years and years of specialized experience. These workers often were not Puritans. Many times they didn't agree with Puritan ways or Puritan laws. They also weren't members of the church or landowners, so they couldn't vote. But they were often people with disposable income. They were people with, who worked hard and who wanted to enjoy themselves. So there were times when these ironworkers faced backlash from the local Puritan lawmakers, right? An ironworker's wife might be fined for wearing fancy lace that was sort of above her status and everything. Or there might be times when there were disagreements or rowdiness from the ironworkers. These are people that were trying to kind of create a new life, sometimes with their families who they brought over from England. And they're people that were on the outskirts, right? These are sort of hardworking laborers outside of the typical Puritan system. So they lived and had unique lives. When the ironworks closed in the late 1660s, early 1670s, mostly due to financial issues. They weren't making the money. There's all sorts of questions about kind of how the books were kept and what was really going on. a lot of these skilled workers are going to leave the Saugus area and start other furnaces or ironworks in other places around Massachusetts mostly, but also into Rhode Island and even further down the Atlantic coast. So while the ironworks itself maybe had a sort of short-lived run, the knowledge that was gained and then spread through the colonies after the ironworks closed is another reason we are a national park here. And another important group of workers is actually Scottish prisoners of war. So during the English Civil War, there were Scottish prisoners of war that were captured during the Battle of Dunbar. And the English decided to sell some of these captured soldiers as indentured servants. Some English investors in the ironworks said, hey, this is a good investment. Let's buy about 35 of these POWs. And they sent them to the ironworks as indentured servants. Usually that would be an indenture of about 7 years. And these prisoners of war were really used for lots of manual labor, hauling, moving things, wood cutting. It doesn't mean that they weren't also paying attention or sometimes learning some of the skills of the ironworking trade while they were here. But often they did not come with a background in ironworking. These are men that were captured on the battlefield and mostly never saw their family again. You know, they were sent across the Atlantic, and Saugus became their new home. Some of them, you know, after their indenture was up, they assimilated. Maybe they married a Puritan woman, or others decided to leave the area, go around to other spots in the New England region. I did mention that there is one historic building from the 1600s on site, and that's called the Ironworks House. For a long time, this was thought of as the Iron Master's house. People thought it might be as old as the 1640s. But through research, including exploration of some of the timbers in the building, this is really a house that was built around 1680. So it's after the ironworks closed. It's next to the site of that ironworks. Over time, it's had many uses. You know, it went from a pretty sizable, nice Puritan home to eventually being used as kind of tenement housing for some of the local mill workers in the 1800s. And in about 1915, there was a big craze for kind of colonial America, right? Looking back at those good old days and trying to learn as much as you could about colonial life. And Wallace Nutting, who was a photographer, he purchased the house in 1915. He tried to restore it to partially what he thought, partially what he wanted the house to look like for a colonial house. In this house, he used it as a tourist attraction. He did lots of studio photography in here with like women in historic costumes, cooking by an open hearth and everything. And some of his photography in the early 1900s helped shape that colonial revival movement, right? And helped create both some history and some myth around what was going on during the 1600s in Massachusetts. Nowadays, that house is open on tours. So you can see it is furnished appropriately to the time period, so 1680s or so. One of those bottom right corner photos shows that historic furnishing in there. And I just wanted to kind of pause here and leave you all with a photo of the ironworks today, right? So this is the Saugus Iron Works. Nowadays, you have the main three industrial buildings, the blast furnace, the forge, and the rolling and slitting mill. Just up here on the left behind the tree would be that ironworks house, as well as our main museum. Our grounds are open 24 hours, but our visitor services are really kicking off at the beginning of June. So starting June 3rd, we'll have rangers on site Wednesdays through Sundays, offering talks, tours, programs about the historic ironworks. So that wraps my main presentation. I do want to hand it to Robert for a minute here and open it up to some questions I can answer.
So folks, let's give Andrew a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And we still have about 10 minutes for questions and comments. If you have any questions, please get them into the Q&A. If you have any comments, please get them into the chat, and we'll address as many as we can. What we don't get to, I will make sure to include Andrew's email address in the follow-up email that will be sent to all of you. And you can always shoot Andrew an email with any questions you may have. So Pat would like to know, are there any children's activities at your site for ages 6 and 9?
Yeah, Pat, great question. Thank you. So we have what's called the Junior Ranger program, which is a way for not just kids, but honestly whole families to help explore the ironworks. And with that, they can get Junior Ranger badges similar to mine, only made out of wood, that they can kind of proudly wear as they explore the site. We're also hoping to offer some special programs specifically geared to families this summer too. So definitely keep an eye on our website and our Facebook page. But it's a great spot to just like bring the family, walk around. You can bring a picnic lunch and just relax at the ironworks on a nice sunny day.
Joyce asks, what is the explanation for some pre-colonial and colonial homes in Massachusetts where the front door is full of iron nails and not necessarily in a decorative pattern? Was that a form of marketing? Would these nails likely have come from Saugus or from England?
Yeah, great question. And I wish I had a better answer for you, because nails were incredibly valuable back then. You know, like we're saying, it takes a lot of work to create that nail rod, and then eventually, usually on your own or with a blacksmith, build nails. Nowadays we think of nails as one of the cheapest things at the hardware store, but it's the exact opposite back then. If a house burned down in the colonial times, they'd go through the rubble and pick out the nails to reuse them again. So why exactly some historic homes have all these nails on the front door? I'm not sure, I'll be honest with you. Part of it might also, sometimes there is a question of, is that from the 1600s, or did that also sometimes come later with that colonial revival of a little more stylized and artistic than it would have been, say, practical from the 1600s. Another piece too is often a lot of the homes that are saved, especially from the 1600s, are homes of usually the wealthiest people or well-off people in the area. So sometimes that can reflect and skew a little bit how we see the materials and the design of their house versus kind of an everyday kind of common worker's house.
We've got a couple of similar questions here.
Yeah.
Cynthia asks, when did the site become a National Historic Site? And Mike asks, when and how did the Park Service acquire the site?
Absolutely. Yeah, great questions. And it's interesting because we've got all this archaeological work that happened historically and everything. Most of that wasn't done initially by the National Park Service. This was actually originally a site that was funded by the American iron and steel industry after the Second World War. There's lots of kind of money flowing and everything, especially in that industry, and they wanted a place where they could get back to the roots of the iron and steel industry. So they hired a local sort of amateur archaeologist named Roland Robbins. He's famous for finding actually where Thoreau's cabin was on Walden Pond. And he came on site and started searching for these ironworks buildings. And then during his excavations, they found hundreds of thousands of different artifacts related to it. So then the initial kind of building and production of these buildings was funded by that iron and steel industry. Eventually, that investment wasn't working out well for them. So they approached the federal government about taking over the site. The government did their own research to make sure, hey, like I said, is this of national significance? Is this really a story that's worth preserving and telling? When the answer was yes, the Park Service took over the site in 1968, I believe. So ever since then, it's been National Park. We still have carpenters on site that build new water wheels and maintain, the water races. So we're the ones, the National Park Service nowadays, taking care of the site.
Oh boy, a lot of questions here, Andrew. There's some
Great.
good ones. Um, when will construction on the site be finished? I think you referenced that.
Yeah. So yeah, great question. So there is construction on the blast furnace right now. So you can see, I don't know if you can see my pointer right now, but this blast furnace here doesn't look like this right now. There is scaffolding around it because they're repairing the charging bridge, which is this wooden bridge towards the top of the blast furnace. That construction is ongoing. It will continue into at least part of the summer. We will be offering guided tours, especially on weekends when construction isn't going on. And then during the week, even with construction happening, we'll have staff throughout the park doing other talks and programs, doing blacksmithing demonstrations in the blacksmith shop we have on site. So we're hoping that construction gets finished up this summer, but I don't have a firm date on the end of that one.
Joan asks, why was it in operation for only 24 years? And Dory asks, why did the ironworks close?
Yeah, great questions. And that one's a bit tough to track down because the financial records from the ironworks are incomplete. It seems like there were financial issues starting as early as the 1650s. So we're talking within the first 5 to 10 years of the ironworks. They're already running into some issues. There's questions about management of the ironworks, questions about where some of the money's going and how it's being accounted for, including some 1600s lawsuits towards some of like the overall sort of overseers of the site. So really it's poor financial reasons and decisions that led to the closure of it. Was it a bit too ambitious for what was needed at that time? Something like the rolling and slitting mill, for example, was that more than the young colony needed? But we don't have a firm, clear answer why it closed by about 1670.
Bill asks, was there a comparable ironworks south of Boston? If so, do you know about that? And we also have questions from Jean, who asks, were there other notable early ironworks in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, or Connecticut?
Yeah, great questions. So before the Saugus Iron Works, they did try with that blast furnace down in the Quincy Braintree area. While that wasn't incredibly successful, they did keep doing some work down there. So there was at least a blast furnace there for a while. Like I said, Furnace Brook Parkway, if you know that area, that's the area you can still see some of the remnants of that blast furnace down there. And yes, there were lots of other different operations that went into ironworks. We like to say that Saugus was the first, successful ironworks in British, colonial America. After its closure, it spawned many other offshoot ironworks out towards the Springfield area, down into Rhode Island. So many of the workers here in Saugus took their knowledge and brought it other places. There's some evidence of, families of iron workers from Saugus being involved in ironworks that are eventually going to help with, say, military gear for the American Revolution. So often this ironworking trade is passed on from family member to family member. So you see many family names that can lead back to Saugus.
Were the Saugus Iron Works as technologically advanced as those in England?
They really were. In terms of scale, I'm sure were bigger ones in England, but especially having that rolling and slitting mill, that was extremely specialized. There's a dozen of those in England at the time, and they decide to bring one out here to what the colonists viewed as the wilderness. That was pretty incredible for the young colony.
All right, I'm just going to merge a bunch of questions together here, Andrew. So these questions come from Kathy and Sherry. Kathy asks, what does Hammersmith refer to? Was there much difficulty for indentured servants to gain their freedom? And do you have records of the Scottish prisoners of wars who worked at Hammersmith?
Yeah, great questions. So Hammersmith was the historic name for the ironworks. So in many 1600s documents, you'll see it referred to as Hammersmith. It also refers to kind of the whole town that came up around it, the housing, the fields and everything. The second question was about indenture. Indenture, you hope that everything kind of runs smoothly. Often it did, and at the end of the terms of the indenture, you became, sort of a free man, most likely with pretty limited things, often kind of the clothes on your back and a few other possessions. Obviously, there are stories of, okay, but who's enforcing these indentures and making sure after the term is up that this person is really freed? So I'm sure there were people that were kind of kept on past their indenture should have been. Can you remind me the third part of that question, Robert? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. So Scottish prisoners of war.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. There's been a lot of great research done on the Scottish prisoners of war, both here in Saugus as well as over in Scotland. So I would recommend you start on our website. There is also part of the museum dedicated to it as well. But website's a great starting point because we also have links to other digital archives.
So Andrew, we got through about 15 questions. There's 15 or so we didn't get to, but that is fine. Folks, I will include Andrew's email address in the follow-up email I send you all. If your question wasn't answered, feel free to email Andrew directly. He'll get you an answer. Let's give Andrew a big virtual round of applause for another wonderful presentation. He's 2 for 2, did a great job. I'll read some of the comments. Thank you for a great presentation, and this final picture you're showing is lovely. We've got a great presentation, Andrew. Sounds like a lovely place. Thank you for your informative presentation, says Diana. I learned so much today. Judy says, thanks for this interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to taking the tour. Carlene says this was very informative. I was there many years ago, and she looks forward to making a return. Just a lot of positive comments in the chat, Andrew. You did a wonderful job as always. Folks, look for that email from me either later today or first thing tomorrow. Feedback survey, recording, information about upcoming talks in this series, along with Andrew's email address. And I'll also provide the link to the Saugus Iron Mills website. Andrew, any last words from you?
I just want to say I feel very lucky for being able to do 2 weeks in a row. I'm sorry I won't be back for next Wednesday, but I'm sure you've got a great presentation. And thank you, Robert, for all you do for these programs. And thank you, everyone, for joining today.
All right. Thanks so much, Andrew. Thank you all. Hope everyone has a great rest of their week. Bye-bye.
Take care, all.